All right, first we're going to go to. We talked about his Julian's case right now. We just spoke to him about the case before the Inter-American Court. We're being joined by one of his many superstar attorneys, Stella Moris. Stella, welcome to Live on the Fly.
Hi, Randy. Hi, Dennis.
Hello.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So I've got like a stack of papers here that I downloaded today that were sent to me, and all of these amicus briefs. And I got to tell you, it's as thick as War and Peace on acid. So I'm not an attorney. Can you just tell us exactly when is this going before the Inter-American Court? And just tell us first, what is the Inter-American Court as opposed to the Organization of American States? Is it part of it?
Well, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights is one of the organs that come out of the OAS. There's also the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And the Inter-American Court considers both cases and issues advisory opinions. So in this case, it will issue an advisory opinion which will address some of the legal difficulties that have come about as a result of the standoff between the UK and Ecuador when Ecuador issued asylum to Julian Assange in 2012.
So Ecuador initially filed this with the OAS or the Inter-American Court. So that was filed. And this is to get not an opinion, but to get a determination? It requested an advisory opinion back in 2016, and then the court opened up the process to consultation, and the response has been really spectacular. As Julian covered a lot of ground, actually. 55 amicus briefs, so briefs written by NGOs, legal academics, member states, expressing their opinion on the questions before the court. And one of my colleagues, Baltasar Garzón, who you will probably know from his attempt to prosecute the Chilean dictator, yes, Pinochet, he wrote a brief, and 22 further individuals and 9 other organizations also signed that. So in reality, we're talking up to something like 80 different organizations and individuals that have actively participated in this process. And why has there been such a phenomenal response? Well, partly it's because this is the first international consultation on the scope of asylum in 41 years. The last one was back in 1975 when the UN Secretary General opened up these questions and states could reply, and there's a very detailed report from back then. But then there's also the global refugee crisis. As you know, it's terrible here in Europe. Last year, 5,000 people died in the Mediterranean, probably many more. Over 1 million people crossed the Mediterranean to seek asylum. Some of them are migrants, others are asylum seekers. So it's really a crisis, very timely advisory opinion. And, of course, Julian's case is also kind of in the background because Ecuador was the one to request the advisory opinion. Dennis?
And this, for instance, this opinion could offer some kind of remedy to, for instance, there is now hell being paid by those folks who are fleeing, say, from Central America through Mexico to the United States and are being prevented even from applying for asylum under U.S. law. Would this be a way to have sort of a regional or hemispheric remedy for the denial of this human right that is supposed to be given under United States law?
Well, the impact of an advisory opinion of this nature is that it informs the interpretation of international obligations. So yes, it may have an impact in that situation. In in relation to states like Australia that use offshore processing as a means to remove rights from asylum seekers, the court will likely come to a conclusion that will help those people to be able to, enforce their rights vis-a-vis Australia.
The decision that the Inter-American Court comes up with, that will influence other international courts?
Yeah, that's right. The Inter-American Court on Human Rights is like the European Court on Human Rights, and if you look at advisory opinions and judgments, you'll see how these international courts refer to each other, to each other's case law. So that's the effect. But I'd like to just talk a little bit, very briefly, about Julian's situation right now and
Please
the
do.
UK. So the UK and Ecuador have had this standoff. As you know, the UK doesn't recognize Julian Assange as a refugee. But there is no question legally that he is a political refugee. And he's a subject of political persecution by the US establishment and its allies. And they don't even seem to feel that they need to hide it. They instituted a banking blockade back in 2010. You have the director of the CIA that dedicates talks not about the threat posed by instability in the Middle East or the bomb in North Korea, but WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. And so I think that it comes down to the symbolic significance of Julian Assange as a political refugee. Back in during the Cold War, political refugees were ideological bullets that were piercing the Iron Curtain. And so a real democracy doesn't produce political refugees, right? They nurture dissent, they nurture freedom of the press and freedom of conscience. And so him as political refugee is actually a huge threat symbolically. And that's why the UK cannot accept him as a political refugee.
Would you say that what he has gone through 5 years there, is that borderline torture to you?
Absolutely. I mean, prisoners have better conditions than Julian Assange has here. He hasn't seen sunlight in over 5 years. He hasn't been able to breathe fresh air. The conditions inside this embassy are really, really restrictive. I think people who come here, even if they hear about this, when they come here, they can't believe it's this small and it's this constricting, and it's just incredible that he's managed to survive and stay sane all this time.
It really is. He is such a resilient individual, and he continues to work very hard. I know people who've been in there. The conditions are really horrendous and oppressive, and I suppose there must be a heat wave going through London at this time, like there is here. And there's no air conditioning there. There's no air, and so to me, it definitely is torture. What do you think is the prospect, or what do you think is going to happen when this is filed, coming up in the next few months?
Well, the situation.
It's in August, right?
Sorry.
When the next step? When is that?
Well, the next step is that the Inter-American Court is holding a series of open hearings, and the court then retreats to write its opinion when it's heard all the opinions. There were so many amicus briefs that were presented that they don't have enough time to study each in detail. So they invited all the organizations and people who submitted to present in person. And then so the decision is probably coming down. The advisory opinion next year.
Well, we have time for just one. We have to go to the 6 o'clock hour and switch over. We're going to be back with Barrett Brown. Dennis, do you have one last question you'd like to ask?
No, I think I'm good on this. I'm just wondering, was this the same court that can offer protection like before the murder of Berta Cáceres, I believe the Inter-American Court called for her to be protected because based on a series of death threats. Would this be within the purview of the court? That they could take an action to protect a human rights activist?
Yeah, that's right, but not directly. It would first have to go through the Inter-American Commission, which would then take it to the court.
I see. So at a certain point, Julian Assange could ask for this kind of protection if he felt endangered.
That's right. And, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, in its findings, found that the UK is violating his Article 7 right of the ICCPR, which is cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. So he could take that action, and we're preparing a series of actions, and that's definitely one of the possibilities.
Why do you think the UK finally is doing this? I mean, are they acting with autonomy here with this decision? Are they totally influenced? Are they a vassal state of the U.S.?
I don't think it's just that. They have their own motivations, and they've invested a lot of prestige into this situation, and so they're not going to let go easily. But at the same time, the situation is becoming more and more untenable. It was already untenable before. He was never charged. The 12 million, probably much higher, probably 20 million US dollars spent on surveillance around this embassy. There's no justification. It's a clear case of political persecution.
It's amazing. He's got incredible support, not just there, but around the world. And it's important that people, they have this group that stands outside with the vigils. That's important, isn't it, that people continue to show up?
That's incredible. And they talk to the people who are passing by. The embassy is right next to Harrods, which is a big London department store. And they've been here for 5 years. And, they have incredible stories to tell themselves. Their commitment comes from deeply personal stories as well, where they've had to.
Well, as long, yeah, and
sorry.
It's right around the corner from an espresso shop there, on Cromwell Avenue, I believe. Listen, we're going to continue here. I can tell you that. As long as I'm at WBAI, we will continue to give it all we can for Julian Assange and for what he stands for. He's a real hero. And
thank you. It's really important what you're doing on informing people.
We will continue doing that. We'll be talking about him in the next half hour with Barrett Brown. Thank you, Ms. Morris, and continue the great work, and I hope things turn out well with the Inter-American Court.